So let me first just say good day, and I'm sorry for those of you who are expecting an Australian accent or maybe an Australian in my role. I'm actually a fourth-generation Californian from San Diego who ended up happily in Sydney, and I've been running the American Chamber of Commerce there for the last year and a half after having been Consul General. I think in having been invited, and I'd like to thank Karen Lanyon and the Good Day team for including me in this. I kind of thought, well, maybe what is needed or what is requested is sort of an American resident perspective on Asia from Australia. But I have to say, to me, it's been a fascinating discussion all day long, and I think all of you who've been through it have really already gotten, I think, a very good sense of how Asia looks from Australia. I'll just make a couple of points, and then I'm going to move down to our very distinguished panel, introduce them briefly. You've got their bios, but I guess I'd make just a couple of points. And one is, I don't really think it's possible to overstate the degree to which Australians are looking north and northwest at Asia. We heard the discussion today about the choice, whether there's a choice to be made. We've heard the discussion about the importance of Asia. I think we all understand the basic economic underpinning, but we'll talk a little bit about that in this panel. But the fact is, most Australians are really quite focused on opportunity that is coming from Asia generally, particularly from China, but increasingly also looking across the Indian Ocean at India and seeing their future prosperity very much based on those kinds of opportunities. It's interesting, I mean, as an American in Australia, first as a diplomat and now with AmCham, I sometimes have occasion to remind Australians that, the United States is, as the Foreign Minister of Australia said last year here in Los Angeles, still Australia's most important economic partner when you put trade and investment all together. And yet, in the polling that takes place in Australia by the Lowy Institute, some 82% of Australians view China as the most important economic partner of Australia, and somewhat less than 20% see the United States in that role, despite the facts that you can bring to the discussion. And frankly, for that, to understand that, I can think of no better person to have on our panel than the Lord Mayor of Perth, which is a sister city to my home city of San Diego, also to Houston.
Yes, thank you. Hello.
And the city that is on the west coast of Australia and therefore in the same time zone as Singapore and Shanghai, and frankly, half of humanity live in more or less in your same time zone. And I think no city is, and also you're, of course, the leading exporter of many of Australia's leading commodities, particularly iron ore from Western Australia. So I don't want to steal any more thunder, but I think listen very carefully to the Lord Mayor and you'll understand a very different perspective, I think, than what you'd hear in Sydney or perhaps what you might hear here in California. Lord Mayor?
Thank you. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this panel discussion and for your interest in our region of Australia. I've been the Lord Mayor of the City of Perth for over 7 years, and prior to that I was working for an economic think tank in Australia as well, known as CEDA. But yeah, I'm Perth born, and very much the realisation of this connectivity to the north and the same time zone and the opportunities it brings is something that is just in our conversation there all the time now. And of course our three biggest trading partners are Japan, Korea, China, and whilst the commodity prices have dropped a little bit lately, there is still so much that we are connecting with in the region. And this morning I was at the Tourism Summit. Obviously a lot of the hotel investment and other things are coming from the partnerships we have with big investors from these regions as well. As I said, those are our biggest trading partners. The Chinese demand for the iron ore in particular fueled the recent mining boom in our state, to the extent that our state is really considered the engine room of the nation. And as a reflection of that economic shift, Australia and Perth are increasingly looking to more deeply engage in this region, and I would say are probably leaders in that because of the contacts that we have forged through the already established markets we have within the resources sector. And so there is a phrase that's been termed to recognise this longitudinal time zone connection, and it's been termed and trademarked by the University of Western Australia, which ranks in the top 100 universities. The term is in the zone. You will often hear us talk about being in the zone, and there is a biannual conference run by the University of Western Australia on that, and we're very proud of the fact that that exists. And, you know, we recognise that by 2030, 2/3 of the world's middle class are going to be in Asia, and it's an expanding middle class. We're keen to connect them with us. We're also very conscious of their demand for good quality food security issues. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead on the program here, but, you know, this is something that we're very well placed in terms of supplying that part of the world with the great produce that comes out of Australia. And, you know, all these things are very relevant to the way we're focusing on dealing with that region. And I think, you know, in some respects, while the terms of trade are projected to decline over the medium term, they have been historically high for some time. We've got other outputs such as coal and iron ore mining that will continue to grow, but the liquefied natural gas production is continuing to develop rapidly, and there was an Asia Century white paper that focused on that. The services sector, of course, is a very big area for us. I travel to Asia a lot myself. I'll be going to Japan later in March, promoting our universities and our education sector. And there is a lot of interest from that region for students to come and study English initially in our colleges, sometimes get their equivalent to enter university and then study at the universities. We have 5 world-class universities in Western Australia, and of course that is complemented across the country. But these universities now are doing very well, providing good education to the students. Many of them will return home, but many of them will remain as contributing citizens. And we just had Australia Day, and you know, I was impressed by the number of them that do choose to stay and have very good jobs. So we are an innovative and reliable producer and supplier of the high quality food that I spoke about. We're keen to obviously work closely to supplying the demands up there, and I think our proximity is obviously one of the key features in that regard. From 2007-8 to 11-12, the largest export region for Western Australia agri-food products was North East Asia, and in 11-12 the top export markets for Western Australian agri-food products were China, Hong Kong particularly, Japan, Indonesia, South Korea and Thailand. So in addition to supplying food product, Australia is also an important partner in sharing best practice initiatives and building food production capacity in the region as well. And I think that corresponds to the exportation of a lot of our skills gained from the mining sector, which is translating globally too. In terms of the comments I made about education, over the past decade, Chinese and Indian markets are starting to really open up. And it's interesting, even though it's a city council, we work very closely with our state government counterpart to focus on the region, and we're really looking now at the Indian Ocean region. We're talking a lot more about India than we have done in the past, and really looking to engage more in that. I'm conscious of the time. You can come back to me if you like.
I definitely will come back.
Okay.
So our next speaker is Professor Jerry Nicholsberg from UCLA. I think you live in northern San Diego County, but your office must be very close to here. Jerry, in addition to being an economic forecaster, has actually had hands-on practical experience working in China, been recognized by the Indian government for his work there, and I think he's an excellent person to be on the panel. I'd also note that he's the only economist on the program today, so if you're going to have contradictory opinions, you're going to have to express them all yourself, and I'm told you're about to. So, Jerry?
I don't have any problem expressing contradictory opinions. In fact, I mean, as I've been listening to this conference, and this is a great conference, appreciate the invitation to speak here, and I want to thank the organizers and all of you who have stayed till the bitter end. But you know, as I've listened to the panels and the speakers, there's sort of this underlying assumption that that Asia is on a trajectory which is kind of an immovable trajectory. It is going to continue the way it has, and I think someone said, you know, it's not a question as to whether China has arrived. They've arrived. It's only a question as to how big they're going to be. As a forecaster, and I do forecasting for the U.S. and California for the Anderson forecast, and I also do some for China. The way in which one does forecast and looks out into the future is you look at the data, and I thought the statement of, you know, let's look at Asian history as the way of looking at the data to predict Asia rather than European was just kind of spot on. But you look at history, and then you say, if the future is like the past, then this will happen. Well, what I'd like to suggest is the future in Asia is not going to be like the past. It is it's going to be different, and that presents challenges, both political, economic, and geopolitical things that we have to worry about, but also presents opportunities. So what do I mean by that? I'm going to make two related statements. The first is that the era of the model of export-led growth as a way to develop a country is over. So that was Japan's model, that was the Four Tigers model, that was China's model. That's gone. And countries are going to have to think about this in a different way. Very much related to that is the era of chasing low-cost labor is also over with. And you can see that in China, and you can see it in the United States, that what has happened is that low-cost labor, which does repetitive manufacturing, is doing stuff that machines can do. And machines work even longer than the impoverished people of Bangladesh. Machines will work around the clock, little downtime for maintenance, and when it becomes the case that capital goods are much more important in the cost structure and labor is not very important in the cost structure, then where you locate is much more dependent upon where your customers are, what the transportation costs are, what political risks exist. So if you have these long attenuated supply lines and there's lots of political risk, or there's risk that, you know, if you look out in San Pedro Bay of the ships just sitting there waiting to be unloaded, you're going to locate closer to your customers. And we see that in the US. We see in China with the rising cost of labor, Chinese factories going to robotics. So this is a changing world. As far as export-led growth, since you can't just have products that are shipped because you have cheaper labor, and in fact, it's sort of moving. That's a moving target, and always has been. You know, everyone wants exports and not imports. Well, everyone can't export. And we're about at the point, maybe not quite, but you know, we're getting there, to the point where you're not just going to be able to push more exports on other countries. And you certainly don't have that cost advantage of low-cost labor. You may have other advantages, and you do have other advantages in countries. So we're going to see growth, a different kind of growth, and the future is not so clear. If you look at what happened with Japan, if you look what has happened with Korea, China has got a declining labor force, amongst other things. China has export-led growth. One of the real serious problems of this economic powerhouse is that they need to turn inward and start producing for themselves. That's really hard to do. For 30 years, Japan has tried to do it. They haven't succeeded. And it's not that they haven't tried, and it's not that Abenomics is not, another sort of way to try and get there. And so this is a very, very difficult thing. I know that the Chinese government officials went to Singapore and said, well, how did you do it? Well, kind of the answer was, well, yeah, but we're sort of a really small place, and we're sitting in the middle where, Singapore is really part of the greater Indonesia-Malaysian economy. and not the same. So I think that, as we look towards the future and the growth of Asia, will it continue to grow? Yes. Will it prosper? Yes, but maybe not in the way that we think it will.
Thanks, Jerry. We'll definitely come back to you for some follow-up questions on implications of what you've just said. Next, I'd like to move down to the president and CEO of the East-West Bank, Julia Gao. Julia and I met over the phone a few weeks ago chatting about this. She's a native of Indonesia who's lived here in Los Angeles for several decades. East-West Bank, I think, is the number 25 U.S. bank by size, but in terms of its expertise and specialization in dealing with Asia, I think it must be top of the heap because you're able to do things for clients from Asia coming to the U.S. and for Americans going to Asia that no other bank is able to do. So, welcome, Julia Gao. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you so much for inviting me here. So at first, when I saw the invitation, I said that, well, maybe, since most of our business, are more towards U.S., China, I'll start with, my personal connection with Australia. So I was born and raised in Indonesia, and actually my older sister went to college in Sydney, Australia, and later, she moved to United States. And also, a few years ago, my brother-in-law and his family actually moved to Australia and still to Sydney and still do business between Australia and Indonesia. But for myself, I came to the United States, 37 years ago to go to school. So I went to college at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And at the time, in the late 70s, I don't want to live there in Urbana-Champaign because the ecosystem is very, very difficult for an immigrant, from Asia, because we had very, a few and no good Chinese restaurants over there. I had to go to Chicago, which is pretty far, and the weather, I was really shocked, coming from Indonesia, a tropical place, and I arrived in January, and I was so shocked how cold that winter can be. So the minute I graduated, I moved to Los Angeles and have been living here ever since. So, and since then, actually, I also adopted UCLA, as, my home college, I guess, because, I've been on the board of the UCLA Foundation and also the health system. So, UCLA is such a great university. So, thank you again for inviting me here. I have been with East-West Bank, since 1989. And when I joined the bank, we were very small, a savings and loan, $400 million savings and loan in Los Angeles. And right now, we are $28 billion in assets with our market cap of over $5 billion. We are the largest, the 25th largest publicly traded banks in the country. And what is unique about East-West is that we focus on, helping, as Neil have mentioned, on this U.S.-China connection. So we help middle market American businesses that go to China, as well as Chinese companies or individuals that come to U.S. If you think of 25 years ago when China just started to open up, most of the American businesses that went to China are the Fortune 500. And, for Fortune 500 companies, they don't really need, our help. They have all their resources to do that. But if you look at the last, 10, 15 years, there's tremendous interest of middle market American businesses to do business in China because China is such a huge market and China is hungry for U.S. technology and some of the, R&D and food products. So entertainment also, many of these industries really see potential of market in China. So as a result, in the last 5-6 years, what East-West Bank has done that has worked really, really well for us is that we built industry expertise and niches in the industries that have tremendous U.S.-China cross-border trade and investments, such as technology, clean tech, life science, aviation, agriculture, and entertainment. So by us having the expertise, we can help the American businesses that go to China, as well as there's tremendous interest from Chinese companies and individuals to invest in the United States. And again, many of them are not familiar with the way businesses are done here in the United States. So one of our value proposition is to help, because of our contact and connection and presence, both in the US and in China, we are able to connect businesses, to local partners and help them, to navigate the regulations. Right now, one of the most sought after advice from us is how to move money between US and China. Only because China has many restrictions. As a foreign company doing business in China, there are restrictions how to transfer money. And East West Bank, we are one of only 3 US banks that have full banking license, both US foreign currency as well as RMB in China. And that's Citibank, JP Morgan, and East West Bank. So obviously, like Citibank, JP Morgan, they are very, very big and they are very global. So most of their clients are the more Fortune 500, Fortune 1000. So we really provide services beyond banking services is what we call for our clients here in the United States. So another point that I just want to mention is that since the financial crisis, U.S. in order to generate jobs, has changed the requirement to get a green card called EB-5, where it used to be that you need to invest $1 million in the active investments to get a green card in the United States. But in 2009, 2010, because of the financial crisis, they allow a $500,000 investment in passive investments, including real estate, construction, projects, for people to get green card in the United States. And there's a 10,000 visa limitation per year. 70–80% of the demand is from China. So the last few years there have been tremendous interest for a wealthy individual for China, to get, this green card in the United States. And sometimes, it's not necessary they want, to come and live here and do business here, but, for the Chinese families, many of them, they would like to send their kids to school here in the United States. And California is actually the #1 choice. And after California, it would be New York. But I would say majority of them come to California and send the kids to school here. So there's a town here, for those of you that are here, you probably heard about Arcadia, that has good school districts that also they have larger lots, and it's easy to build the homes. So there has been tremendous interest in Arcadia, that right now the home prices in Arcadia is 35% higher than the peak before the financial crisis. And I just wanted to add some personal story is that I actually lived in Arcadia for 18 years. So I moved to Arcadia in 1985, and on my street I was the second Asian family. There was a Korean family, and then us, going in Arcadia. So when I, left Arcadia to move to Pasadena 18 years later, 80% of the families on that street are Chinese, and mostly from China.
Thank you very much, Julia. If I could come back to something that Jerry triggered, and at least in my thinking, and then it's open for the entire panel, as is everything, to comment on. The whole, the topic of this is fast-tracking growth in Asia. You've laid out some of the challenges that Chinese policymakers and leaders have to succeed at to continue. I think the IMF is now projecting 7% growth for the next 5 years, something like that, which is down from the 11% of the last decade or so average. But do you think that they'll be successful in meeting these challenges? And if not, do you see prospects for slower growth? How do you see the future economic trends?
First of all, we have to be a little skeptical of those numbers. The recent report from Chinese provinces just came in, and only one met its target. And those are the official reports on which the political leaders in the provinces are judged. So exactly how fast China is growing, if at all, once you take out the movement of peasants to the cities, is open to question. Will China be successful in making this transition? The leaders are very cognizant of it. I think someone mentioned in an earlier panel that Xi Jinping, is worried about the ability of the Communist Party to stay in power. And I think the worry there is, can they make this transition? Because if they cannot make the transition, then there's going to be a whole host of other problems associated with the Chinese economy and political stability. So they're very cognizant of it. They are trying very hard to do it, but as they started to do it in 2010, they ran into a dramatically slowing economy. Out came the stimulus packages and more infrastructure and more ghost cities. And then they said, okay, we've done that. We're not going to do it again. And we're going to rope in the shadow banking system. And what's happened? Well, the economy's slowing, so they're pumping lots of money into the economy and letting the shadow banking system expand. It's a tough needle to thread. But they may well be able to pull it off because they are acutely cognizant that their life and power depends on that.
Well, let me ask Lisa Scafidi. I mean, the well-being of your city and state depend very much on the answer to this question. What's the thinking from Perth?
Well, look, the thinking from Perth is that we are, having an active presence in these markets. But as someone who does spend a bit of time in China, I am sorry to say on Chatham House rules here, I'm hoping that, we're not threatened anytime too soon by this. I think, there is an insatiable demand for a lot of product, but I think, in terms of world supremacy and all of these things, I tuned into a couple of the sessions earlier. There's still a way to go, and I think we just all need to get on. I liked the comment at the conclusion of the last session that we all just need to be very realistic about just doing the best we can, trade and support, awareness of cultural differences, and just all trying to support one another in the best way possible.
Thank you. Let me go back to Julia with a question. I think among all the people that have spoken today, you're the one who's doing the most business, actual business, with China. So we talked earlier that before you arrived, I think there was a good discussion about the rule of law, how important it is for Americans, how absent it is in the Chinese context, and frankly in some other countries in the region. Obviously, you're able to work in both directions successfully. So what sort of tips do you have for, dealing with, giving advice to Californians or Americans who want to do business but aren't familiar with that kind of environment, lack of transparency, those kinds of issues?
In most of the cross-border investments or trade, when you do business in other country, and China is no different than any other country, what we normally suggest to our clients here is that to find a connection, and that's what we can come to play to help them find the local connection, so that in general, they are better off to partner with some local partners, people that are very familiar with how things are done and the regulations. That actually advice is also true. Like so many now Chinese companies or Chinese individuals that come to United States, to California to do business, they in general too, like the bigger the projects, the more that they try to partner with a local partner, because even here, California, to some degree is also, a very difficult place, to do business and to get permitting. So I would say that, that's how we are here, to help our clients, and we try to find the connections. And for, most of those businesses, they value us as a partner to connect them.
Lisa, any lessons from the Perth perspective on that?
Well, the other thing that's just occurring to me is you're from Indonesia, did you say that? Yeah, I mean, Indonesia is closer to Western Australia than China, and it's China, 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 but there are still big other countries in this region that we need to consider and talk about. I'm quite embarrassed from Western Australia that our engagement with Indonesia isn't bigger. There is a huge opportunity there, as there is in Malaysia and other countries, and yet there is this constant focus on China. And yet, in reality, we know it's hugely urbanised now, but there is still a broad spectrum there. So I think, again, if we're talking about serious engagement in the region looking north, there are many, many countries there, and it shouldn't all be focused on China, albeit it is a big interesting aspect from a geopolitical perspective as well.
Thanks for bringing us back to that point. I think one of the things I've observed in Australia with these 3 free trade agreements that were concluded, they didn't just happen. I mean, it was a lot of political will and engagement, and the sight of the Australian Prime Minister visiting these countries, usually with an enormous delegation of the top businessmen in Australia, as a way of, I think, showing respect and showing interest in the market, is really quite extraordinary. And I know the trade minister, Andrew Robb, who's now been asked to conclude a free trade agreement with India, was just in India last week, just before President Obama came, again with the top businessmen, sort of the ASX or the Fortune 25 or maybe 50 biggest Australian companies represented. So, as you listen to your constituents in Perth, who are the closest and on the Indian Ocean and looking across at India, for example, what are they saying about the opportunity and how best to, make use of, the doors that have been opened?
Yes, we're very conscious of the fact that for the United States, we can be a great partner providing a strong Western presence in the time zone and that movement up into the region. So that is something we're actively spruiking, I suppose, and working with our American counterparts on. But I think, really it does come down to basics of having a really true and respectful appreciation for the culture, getting to know people, because, the Asian cultures in particularly are very focused on that relationship build ahead of doing business. They really want to know you as people. While trade can be a very pragmatic thing, you need something, I can supply it, I supply it, you buy, you're happy, and we move on. At the end of the day, loyalty and longevity is going to be better served through appreciation and respect for the cultures. And I think that's something that the Western culture doesn't appreciate as much, and I think it's something that the more you spend time in these regions, you realise you are going to have a much better long-term relationship by really working on those aspects and showing that respect.
Maybe come back a little bit to education. I know when Carlos from the LA Chamber was speaking earlier, he was talking about the challenge of getting particularly SME representatives in the state to understand the differences and how to be successful in the way you're talking. Part of it's cross-cultural. And then there was mention of something called the Reverse Colombo Plan, which is something this government has launched to try to get Australians to study in Asia, which is pretty remarkable when you think that 1 in 10 Australians speaks an Asian language at home, and 3 in 10 were born in a different country. They have sort of this embedded ability. But let's talk a little bit about, and maybe Julia, I mean, you're actually an example of how education leads to, success across the Pacific. And then Lisa, you mentioned your 5 universities.
I've got some good comments on that, but I'd love to hear yours.
Okay, Julia, and then Lisa, and then the educator.
I think that's why California is such a great place, and the diversity in California. So if you look at the demographics, many of the people here they speak different languages, so Chinese, Spanish, and many. And they are more exposed to different cultures and more acceptable, to to learn the different culture. And if anything, like many of the kids, they go to immersion, like a Chinese immersion school or some, other language. So I really think that, education, especially for the people from China, they really place so much importance for the children to come to school here. And I believe that, their number one target is to send the kids to school in the United States. And, after that is the English-speaking countries. Canada, Australia, England, are the most favorite countries to send the kids to school. Many years ago, just like my generation too, we usually go to school overseas, as a college student after we finish high school. But if you look at the demographics, for those people from China, and it's the same thing is also true, I think, that for Korea, that they like to send their children to school at the earlier, primary school, secondary school, high school. So I do think that, over time, all this cross-collaboration and all the cultural understanding will just lead to a better business relationship. So I really believe, what Lisa said is really good, is that, people are more and more open, to understanding and learning the different culture, and not to, always just insist of only one way of doing business.
Well, I've got two quick stories I'd love to share. I go to a lot of these educational fairs in all parts of China, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, you name it, I've been to them all. They're quite humbling experiences, because what you see are parents who are probably living in one-room flats, and they're shopping around for universities to send their children to. This will be the biggest single expenditure that they've ever made in their life. They don't buy houses and live like we do, and the way they're shopping around for these universities for their children, they realise this is a meal ticket for their children. This is the future, and they will put their heart and soul into educating their kids, and they're going around these trade fairs shopping, and it is just a very humbling experience to see that. And I wish I could bring our Aussie kids who take their education opportunities for granted to these trade shows to see how these kids are so hungry to come to these schools, because then they would start studying maybe a little bit more and appreciate the fantastic school opportunities and lifestyle they have. And you're right in terms of America is seen as the aspiring, they want to send their kids to an American school, particularly these Ivy League colleges that we all know about and love in the United States. But of course, it's a critical mass thing. There isn't the numbers, they can't all go. But I had a very interesting conversation with the immediate former mayor of Chengdu in the Sichuan province, Mayor Ge, who is a highly respected former businessman from Bao Steel. He's moving very fast in China. He's now back to being a CEO of a Fortune 500 company in Beijing now. And I said to him in a meeting, whilst we had many vice-chancellors from our universities doing the rounds there, I said, we'd love you to send some of your students to our university. And the media were there, and I couldn't understand at the time, I do now, why he was kind of cool about the response, because of course it was really an insult. I was saying, come to our universities. He's saying, no, they must go to our top universities in China. Well, the reality is they can't all fit into the top universities in China either. They have to look outward, but he didn't want to acknowledge that our system is as good as it is, and it was kind of interesting for me to learn and appreciate that, so I tone those comments down now. And we also don't want to look too materialistic in terms of searching their markets out and just looking at them as money for our universities. So it is very much the relationship, and it's been an interesting learning curve for me to see how to move into those markets and have those conversations. All that being said, there is a huge opportunity for our countries to obviously work together. The alumni benefit, if they go back to their own country, they're going to have the greatest affiliation with the respective countries, have had life experience in those countries, maybe some initial work experience in those countries. However, if they stay on in your respective cities and, like you have, work in the United States, still a fantastic two-way connection with the counterpart country. And so it is a win-win, and we need to view it as that, and that is just the changing dynamic in the world. I'll just make one other comment. My husband's an Italian, Australian-born son of Italian migrants. And I remember my father-in-law who passed saying, yes, when they were leaving Sicily after World War II, they wanted to go to an A country. They didn't care which country it was, but they knew an A country was going to give them a good future life. America, Australia, Argentina. They ended up coming to Australia and made a beautiful new life there. I have this view, we're all on the world for a short period of time in our life. We just need to all respect each other, get on with it, and share.
Well said. Listen, I've asked my last question, but Jerry, you actually teach, I'm sure, many Asian students here at UCLA. You probably have a perspective on this issue of education.
Sure. You know, when we think about education, particularly, say, U.S. or Australian education of foreign students, that's an export. And in this new economy that we're moving into, this information economy, education is the growth industry. And education can be a growth export. And we need to think about it like that. So we think about our universities as, well, they're going to educate our children. But we need to think about them as they're going to educate our children, and we're going to sell that education to others, because this is very much an expanding area, and it's not a good, it's a service, but it creates good jobs. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future.
I'd say in Australia there's quite a recognition of it as an export.
Yeah.
It's not just iron ore, it's not just coal. There's a lot of tourists coming from China and a lot of students. But Lisa wanted to comment on Reverse Colombo Plan.
The Reverse Colombo Plan is a really interesting initiative. The take-up's still, you know, being seen. Again, it comes back to the culture. The respect I have for the students from the Asian region, well, initially they're wanting to learn English and get that exposure, and like everybody in the world today, they've grown up watching Western television and they aspire to have a Western lifestyle. But the reality is the other way around. Do our kids want to put the hard yards into learning a foreign language? Chinese is a hard language, Indonesian, and all these other languages. So unless perhaps they had a mindset on looking towards a career that was particularly relevant in those countries, unfortunately the take-up isn't so strong. And I think what I'm observing is they're utilising the universities that do dual language, tuition.
Thank you. We have